What if the weapon the army almost threw away turned out to be the one tool capable of breaking the deadliest defenses ever built? Before the flamethrower became a symbol of raw battlefield terror, it was seen as a relic, a clumsy machine that commanders quietly hoped would fade into obscurity. But history has a strange habit of resurrecting what we think we no longer need, and when the army rediscovered the flamethrower's true power, the world of warfare changed in ways no one was prepared for. The story begins not with soldiers charging into bunkers, but with military strategists sitting in dimly lit rooms, staring at blueprints of a weapon they believed had reached its end. The early flamethrowers were heavy, unstable, unpredictable devices that seemed more dangerous to the operator than to the enemy. Fuel tanks leaked, ignition systems failed, and the very idea of carrying a container of pressurized fire on your back felt like suicide wrapped in metal. So the army quietly shelved it, filing the weapon under too risky, too outdated, too impractical. It should have died there, forgotten, dismissed, erased. But war has a way of exposing weaknesses long before leaders are ready to confront them. As battles grew more complex and enemies blended into landscapes of tunnels, reinforced bunkers, dense forest lines, and hidden fortifications, something became painfully clear. Rifles and grenades were no longer enough. Soldiers found themselves pinned down by enemies they couldn't see, enemies protected by layers of earth, steel, and concrete. Standard tactics failed. Artillery fire softened positions but rarely cleared them, and every new attempt led to mounting casualties. Whispers began circulating not about new weapons, but about lost ones. The army had abandoned a tool built specifically for situations like these. Had they made a mistake? This question spread through command posts like a quiet alarm. Reports from the field described entire squads trapped outside fortified positions that simply refused to break, machine gun nests hidden deep inside caves, enemy fighters who vanished into holes in the earth, reinforced doors that shrugged off explosives. And every time things reached a standstill, one phrase kept appearing in after-action notes: no effective method of clearing position. That phrase terrified commanders, because a battlefield without solutions is a battlefield without survival. Slowly, reluctantly, the army reopened file on the flame. Engineers were told to reassess the weapon not as a relic, but as a tactical instrument. Soldiers were interviewed about what they needed to survive the new kind of warfare emerging right in front of them, and as those needs became painfully clear, a simple but shocking realization emerged: the army hadn't abandoned the flamethrower because it was useless. They abandoned it because they underestimated how drastically the battlefield was about to change. The first tests were cautious, almost secretive. Modified systems were built, lighter tanks designed, fuel mixtures adjusted for reliability and reach, and when that first stream of fire erupted in controlled tests, illuminating the field with a roaring burst of heat and pressure, the officers watching didn't speak. They just stared, because they realized they were not looking at a primitive weapon. They were looking at a psychological force powerful enough to alter human behavior, influence enemy decisions, and change outcomes before a single shot was fired. Suddenly, the question was no longer why bring the flamethrower back. It became, what have we lost by never understanding its real potential? That question would shape everything that happened next, turning an abandoned tool into one of the most feared and strategically misunderstood weapons of the modern battlefield. And the moment commanders saw what the flamethrower could truly do, they knew the world had entered a new era of warfare, one where fire itself could unlock victories previously thought impossible. Before we push deeper into this story and uncover how the Army's forgotten weapon transformed into one of the most decisive tools on the battlefield, take a moment to engage with this video so the full context doesn't get lost. Understanding how a single tactical shift reshaped entire operations is crucial, and your interaction actually helps this kind of historical content reach more people who appreciate these hidden military truths. So share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me whether you believe the Army underestimated the flamethrower, or if you think its return was inevitable. And while you're here, make sure to hit the like button and confirm your subscription, because what comes next reveals layers of strategy and psychological warfare that most people have never heard about. As the Army revisited the shelved concept of the flamethrower, the battlefield was already transforming into something far more unforgiving than earlier planners had imagined. The terrain itself had become a weapon. Dense jungles swallowed entire platoon. Cave networks twisted through mountains like labyrinths carved by invisible hands. Bunkers layered with steel and reinforced earth turned into miniature fortresses that refused to fall, no matter how many shells exploded above them. In these brutal environments, the limitations of traditional firepower became painfully obvious, and soldiers quickly learned that the enemy didn't need superior numbers. They only needed superior cover. It was inside these dark, suffocating spaces that the Army realized they were fighting not just opponents, but the very landscape. Stories filtered back from the front lines describing terrifying encounters where entire squads advanced through thick smoke only to be pinned by a single gunner hidden behind layers of rock. Grenades bounced off hardened doors. Bullets ricocheted into nothingness. Even explosives failed to reach enemy fighters who had vanished deep inside twisting tunnels. And every failed assault carried the same haunting undertone. If a soldier couldn't reach an enemy physically, there was no guarantee he would come back at all. The psychological toll grew heavier. The sense of helplessness spread. Officers knew they needed a solution that wasn't just stronger but fundamentally different, something capable of reaching into spaces where rifles, mortars, and standard tactics had no effect. That turning point came during a series of engagements where the terrain dictated the outcome before the battle even began. Units advancing through jungle-covered ridges reported enemies emerging from hidden apertures, firing a few bursts, and disappearing again before anyone could respond. These fighters weren't just protected. They were emboldened. They knew the Army lacked a precise method to penetrate their defenses, and each failed attempt forced commanders to confront a harsh truth. Overwhelming firepower meant nothing without a tool capable of reaching inside those fortified shadows. It was during these moments of frustration that the memory of the discarded weapon resurfaced. The flamethrower was not a tool of precision. It was a tool of presence. Fire behaved differently from bullets. It curved, expanded, crawled into corners, swept across surfaces, and forced movement where none would normally occur. It didn't simply attack, it dominated space. Strategists who had once dismissed it began re-examining battlefield reports with new eyes, looking for patterns they had overlooked, and the patterns were everywhere. Every stalemate, every failed bunker assault, every tunnel ambush pointed to the same glaring gap. The Army needed a weapon that could reach where soldiers physically could not. Testing began again, this time not with the intention of phasing the weapon out, but with the hope of finally understanding how it could reshape tactical thinking. Engineers were urged to push boundaries rather than cautiously preserve them. If the flamethrower could be made safer, more efficient, more predictable, then maybe the army hadn't misjudged it. Maybe they had simply underestimated the future. Soldiers participating in early evaluations described something they hadn't felt in months. The possibility of taking back the initiative, the raw heat, the expanding flame, the shockwave of pressure rolling out of a nozzle signaled more than destruction. It signaled control. Yet the most surprising realization wasn't tactical, it was psychological. Enemy fighters who had stood their ground against rifles, grenades, and artillery reacted entirely differently when fire entered the equation. Flame didn't just threaten life, it shattered confidence. It turned protective darkness into a vulnerable space. It forced decisions instantly, and commanders began to wonder how many casualties, how many months of stalled offensives had resulted from abandoning this weapon just when it was needed most. But the real transformation came when field units tested the redesigned models in controlled mock assaults. Unlike the older, hazardous versions, these new systems were more balanced, more stable, more responsive. For the first time, soldiers felt they were wielding a deliberate instrument rather than an unpredictable hazard. And as the first arcs of fire swept across reinforced structures, revealing weaknesses that standard explosives had never exposed, the army began seeing glimpses of a weapon that could fundamentally shift battlefield momentum. Still, despite the newfound potential, doubts lingered. Could this rediscovered tool truly change the course of engagements that had cost so many lives? Could it become the breakthrough that soldiers needed to finally overcome the entrenched positions that had dominated the battlefield? The answer would come soon, and in a way no one expected, during operations that would not only validate the flamethrower, but redefine its identity entirely. Before we move forward, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the Army should have realized sooner that conventional weapons weren't enough for these environments? As reports from the field grew more detailed and alarming, commanders finally understood that the real enemy wasn't just the opposing army, it was the architecture of war itself. Fortified bunkers, subterranean tunnels, concealed firing ports, and interlocking defensive networks created an invisible battlefield where the rules had completely changed. The enemy didn't need to stand in the open or match American firepower head-on. They simply needed to disappear behind concrete, rock, and earth, and let the geography do the killing. And this shift began exposing a terrifying imbalance. The Army's most advanced weapons simply couldn't reach the threats that mattered most. Machine gun nests carved deep into hillsides were practically immune. 2 small arms. Artillery shells shook the ground, but rarely reached those hidden chambers. Grenades rolled to the wrong angles or detonated harmlessly outside sealed doors. Even demolition teams struggled, because the very entrances to these positions were designed to channel blasts away rather than inward. Soldiers described approaching bunkers that felt more like the mouth of a living creature, dark, silent, and ready to swallow anyone who dared step forward. And every failed attempt to clear them widened the psychological gulf between what troops needed and what their equipment could actually provide. One after-action report captured the desperation perfectly. We hear them breathing in the dark, but we cannot reach them. It wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was the truth. The enemy thrived in these hidden spaces, moving through tunnels that branched like veins beneath the battlefield. They could ambush, retreat, reappear, and hold positions that the Army couldn't even physically enter. Traditional tactics simply weren't built for this environment, and every new engagement revealed a disturbing reality. When the enemy chose to vanish underground, American firepower lost its meaning. This realization prompted a deeper review of historical conflicts in search of parallels. Military historians and strategists identified a repeating pattern whenever warfare shifted into enclosed, fortified environments, conventional weapons lost effectiveness. Siege warfare, trench systems, cave networks, urban ruins. In every era, battles were won not by the strongest weapon, but by the weapon capable of penetrating barriers, literal and psychological. The army began to understand that their current arsenal was built for open field engagements, not for the hollow, claustrophobic battlegrounds shaping the new war. It was during these strategic reviews that the flamethrower reappeared not as a relic, but as a missing puzzle piece. Fire, unlike bullets or explosives, behaves according to its own physics. It expands into voids. It rolls through air pockets. It flows along surfaces. It fills the spaces the enemies rely on for protection. Where grenades create a momentary blast, flame creates an environment that consumes everything inside it. An officer studying the report started seeing a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight. Every defensive advantage the enemy relied on was specifically vulnerable to heat, pressure, and fear. Another revelation emerged from interviews with frontline soldiers. Many described the emotional paralysis they felt approaching dark openings, unsure whether an enemy waited inside or whether the tunnels extended deeper than expected. The unseen became more dangerous than the seen. But when soldiers were asked what tool would make them feel confident approaching those same openings, the answer repeated itself with striking consistency: fire. Not rockets, not grenades. Fire. This was the breakthrough moment. The army realized that the flamethrower wasn't simply a weapon. It was an antidote to environments that negated every other tool. It erased the protective advantage of darkness, forced enemies out of hiding, and reshaped terrain temporarily in the operator's favor. It reached into the very places where the battlefield had previously stopped, creating possibilities no other weapon could match. But even as this understanding took root, a critical question remained. Could the flame truly overcome the strongest fortifications the enemy built? Could it succeed where every other tactic had failed? That question would soon be tested in real operations, and the results would challenge everything the army thought it knew about fire, fear, and survival in the harshest corners of war. What happened next would redefine how the army viewed not just the flamethrower, but the very psychology of warfare. For months, analysts had focused on the weapon's mechanical shortcomings and tactical limitations, but almost no one had stopped to consider the invisible battlefield. The battlefield inside the human mind. The breakthrough didn't come from engineers or strategists. It came from soldiers, men who had stared into the darkness of enemy bunkers and felt something far more dangerous than bullets. The creeping certainty that the unseen enemy had the advantage. And as testimonies accumulated, a startling truth emerged. The flamethrower was not merely a physical weapon. It was a psychological force. Early field tests revealed something unexpected. When fire entered an enclosed space, the effect wasn't immediate destruction. The effect was panic. The roar of ignition, the violent eruption of light, the sudden spike in temperature, the sense that the environment itself had turned hostile, all of it forced enemies to react instinctively. Soldiers reported seeing enemies abandon fortified positions long before the flame reached them. Some surrendered. Some fled deeper into tunnels. Others simply froze, paralyzed by the one threat that bypassed training, discipline, and tactical preparation. Bullets could be dodged. Explosives could be anticipated. But fire tapped into something primal, something older than war itself. This realization spread quickly through the ranks of commanders who had previously dismissed the weapon. They began to understand a critical distinction. Most weapons killed by precision, pressure, or force. Fire kills by presence. It does not ask for permission. It does not negotiate. It fills the air, reshapes the environment, and destroys the sense of control that soldiers depend on to function under stress. In one recorded engagement, an entire fortified position surrendered moments after seeing a flamethrower team approach. The weapon hadn't even been used yet. The implication was unmistakable. The fear of flame was as effective as the flame itself. Military psychologists started analyzing why this reaction was so universal. Their findings pointed to evolutionary instinct. Fire represents survival in some contexts, but in confined spaces, it represents extinction. Smoke, heat, and the unpredictable movement of flame attack multiple senses simultaneously, overwhelming a soldier's ability to make rational decisions. The enemy no longer feared the man holding the weapon. They feared the environment becoming their enemy. And once that shift occurred, even the strongest bunker felt like a trap. This insight reshaped tactical thinking. The flamethrower wasn't simply a breaching tool. It was a method of breaking the enemy's will. Strategists quickly began incorporating this psychological dimension into assault planning. Instead of deploying flamethrower operators as brute force solutions, they were used to trigger panic, flush defenders out, and collapse defensive discipline. In several operations, flame teams were positioned deliberately within sight of fortified positions, knowing the enemy would interpret their presence as a sign of impending annihilation. And time after time, the reactions were the same: panic, retreat, surrender. One of the most telling examples came from a training simulation where opposing forces played the role of defenders inside mock bunkers. When the flamethrower ignited outside, even knowing it was controlled and not lethal in the exercise, several participants instinctively abandoned their posts. Commanders observing the drill realized they weren't witnessing tactical failure, they were witnessing an involuntary human response. Fire didn't just burn, it broke resolve, and this understanding changed everything. The army had spent years trying to engineer solutions to fortify defenses, but the real advantage had been sitting quietly in their archives the entire time, a weapon that didn't just attack the body, but the mind. The moment this truth became clear, the flamethrower was no longer a relic. It was a strategic asset of psychological dominance, capable of shifting the balance of power before the first spark even touched the battlefield. But the most dramatic proof of its potential would come not from simulations or theory, but from a series of real operations where the flamethrower exposed weaknesses the army never knew existed, and revealed strengths they hadn't realized they possessed. Once the army understood the psychological force of the flamethrower, attention shifted to a more practical question. Could the weapon be returned into something reliable enough for modern warfare? The early models had been clumsy, dangerously unstable, and terrifying even to the operator. If the army wanted to bring the flamethrower back into the battlefield with confidence, it needed more than tactical justification. It needed engineering, and in workshops where metal clanged and blueprints layered across tables, a quiet revolution began. The redesign started with a simple mandate: make the weapon safer for the soldier carrying it. Engineers stripped apart the old fuel tanks. Examining every weakness, they reinforced the structure with improved alloys, reshaped the tanks to distribute weight more evenly, and added pressure regulators that prevented the disastrous leaks that had once made the weapon infamous. Early operators had joked that carrying a flamethrower felt like walking with a bomb on your back. Now, for the first time, the tank felt secure, balanced, and far less intimidating. But safety was only the first step. The next challenge was ignition. Older systems often sputtered or failed at the worst possible moment, leaving soldiers exposed while trying to coax life into a stubborn flame. Engineers replaced unreliable components with electric ignition systems that worked in rain, mud, and extreme humidity. Tests showed near-perfect reliability, a breakthrough so significant that one officer remarked it changed the weapon from a gamble into a guarantee. That sense of trust would become critical in the field, where hesitation often meant death. Once ignition was stabilized, focus turned to range and fuel efficiency. The previous generation of flamethrowers delivered short, inconsistent bursts. The new fuel mixture created a longer, more stable arc with a thicker, more cohesive stream. Not only did this extend operational reach, but it also allowed the flame to behave predictably, giving operators unprecedented control. This wasn't wildfire spilling into the air. It was directional, intentional, a tool shaped by precision rather than chaos. And then came one of the most transformative innovations: improved hose design. The original hoses were stiff, heavy, and prone to clogging. But by experimenting with flexible polymers and internal lining coated to reduce corrosive buildup, engineers created hoses that moved with the operator rather than against him. This increased mobility in tight terrain bunkers, trenches, narrow cave openings, giving the a fluidity it had never possessed before. Suddenly, the weapon could adapt to environments where rigid systems would have failed. With the structural improvements complete, the engineering teams confronted one final challenge: training. A powerful weapon means little without operators who understand its nuances. The Army developed specialized instruction programs for flamethrower teams, emphasizing coordination, situational awareness, and safety. These soldiers practiced maneuvering with full tanks, firing in controlled bursts, sweeping corners, and coordinating with infantry support. The goal wasn't simply to use the weapon, it was to master it. And as these units became more proficient, the flamethrower evolved from an improvised tool into a disciplined instrument of war. The first field trials with the redesigned weapon shocked even the engineers who had built it. Operators moved with confidence, sweeping through mock fortifications in ways that seemed impossible with earlier versions. The controlled flame arcs illuminated every corner of a structure, revealing potential ambush points and forcing hypothetical defenders into exposed positions. Officers observing the tests noted something profound. The flamethrower no longer looked like a desperate weapon used in rare circumstances. It looked like a strategic asset capable of reshaping entire operations. But the real proving ground was still ahead. No amount of controlled testing could replicate the stakes, unpredictability, and brutality of the battlefield. The redesigned flamethrower would soon be placed into the hands of soldiers facing real enemies in real fortifications. And what happened next would decide whether the Army's gamble had paid off or whether they had simply reinvented a weapon destined to fail under pressure. The true test of the redesigned flamethrower came not in workshops or controlled training grounds, but in the unforgiving chaos of real combat. When the first units were deployed with the updated weapon, commanders didn't announce it with fanfare. They simply integrated quietly into small squads assigned to some of the most difficult missions: bunker assaults, cave clearings, reinforced pillbox breaches, and defensive strongholds that had resisted every prior attempt to dislodge the enemy. If the redesigned flamethrower was going to earn its place in the Army's arsenal, this was where it would happen. The first operation took place against a complex of interlinked tunnels carved deep into a ridgeline. Infantry had attempted to take the position multiple times, only to be halted by machine gun bursts emerging from narrow firing slits. The defenders were dug in so deeply that grenades and explosives barely rattled them. Traditional tactics had failed repeatedly, and morale was fading. When flamethrower operators were added to the assault plan, skepticism filled the camp. Many soldiers remembered the reputation of the earlier models: unpredictable, dangerous, almost mythical in their risk. But this Jimmy's something felt different. The operators carried themselves with quiet confidence, moving like men who knew their equipment worked with them, not against them. During the assault, infantry teams advanced under covering fire as the flamethrower operators moved toward the cave entrance. Observers later described the moment the flame burst into the darkness as a turning point in the entire engagement. The stream of fire didn't just illuminate the tunnel. It exposed the defenders' illusion of safety. Within seconds, the enemy's return fire collapsed. Shouts echoed from within, and several fighters fled deeper into the cave system, abandoning the choke point that had held off multiple assaults. For the first time, the army had a way to reach inside and disrupt the tactical advantage that defenders believed was absolute. Another operation took place on a heavily fortified coast bunker designed to withstand artillery strikes. Earlier attempts to breach it had resulted in high casualties, leaving commanders desperate for a breakthrough. When flamethrower teams approached, they used the weapon not just to attack, but to manipulate the environment. Bursts of flame were directed along the bunker's ventilation openings, filling the interior with heat and pressure. The defenders, suddenly unable to breathe comfortably, were forced to shift positions, revealing weaknesses in their defense. Infantry teams seized the moment, storming the bunker with minimal losses. Afterward, one officer wrote that the flamethrower had turned a stone wall into an open door. But perhaps the most revealing operation occurred during a nighttime mission in dense jungle terrain. The enemy had created a network of concealed pits, trenches, and hidden rooms beneath the forest floor. These structures were nearly impossible to detect until soldiers were already under fire. Flamethrower operators were brought forward to disrupt the ambush. When their nozzles sent sweeping arcs of flame across the ground and into openings, something remarkable happened. The jungle, normally an ally to the hidden defenders, betrayed them. Fire revealed the outlines of concealed entrances, forced movement where none had existed moments earlier, and exposed the defenders' positions long enough for infantry to suppress them effectively. The reports from these operations shared a consistent theme. The flamethrower didn't merely neutralize fortified positions, it dismantled the enemy's confidence in those positions. Fire stripped away the illusion of safety, transforming the battlefield in ways commanders hadn't fully appreciated. What had once been moments of stalemate turned into breakthroughs. What had once been near suicidal assaults transformed into coordinated advances. As the weapon continued proving itself, officers began rethinking battlefield doctrine entirely. The flamethrower wasn't just an accessory to infantry operations. It was a catalyst. It changed enemy behavior, reshaped terrain advantages, and allowed the army to conduct offensive maneuvers that had previously been impossible. It filled the gaps left by traditional weapons, bridging the distance between where soldiers could reach and where the enemy believed they were untouchable. Yet even with these successes, the army hadn't fully grasped the weapon's broader impact. They had seen what it could accomplish tactically. They had witnessed its psychological influence, but the deeper implications, how it would alter not just battles, but the mindset of both sides, were just beginning to surface. That understanding would come next, when the human response to flame became impossible to ignore. As the flamethrower's effectiveness became undeniable, a new layer of the weapon's impact began to surface, one far more profound than the tactical successes commanders documented in their reports. Soldiers on both sides were not merely reacting to a weapon. They were reacting to the emotional weight of what fire represented on the battlefield. For the army, the flamethrowers' resurgence marked the return of something they had been missing since the conflict shifted underground and into fortified spaces: the ability to seize psychological dominance. But for the enemy, its reappearance signaled something far more terrifying: the collapse of the protective distance they believed their fortifications provided. Frontline units started gathering testimonies from infantry squads advancing behind flamethrower operators. Many described a phenomenon they hadn't expected: a newfound confidence that emerged the moment the tank-bearing soldier stepped into position. Men who had previously hesitated to approach cave mouths or entrenched firing slits now advanced with urgency, knowing the enemy could no longer hide behind darkness, steel, or rock. Interviews, several soldiers admitted that seeing the flame ignite triggered a feeling of momentum, a sense that the battlefield was shifting in their favor even before the attack began. The flamethrower had become a kind of promise, a promise that the stalemate was finally breaking. But the psychological shift on the enemy side was even more revealing. Captured fighters described the moment they saw the nozzle in the hands of an approaching operator as the instant the battle was already lost. They explained that, unlike bullets or explosives, which could sometimes be predicted or countered, fire made their surroundings betray them. Tunnels that once felt like protective shells suddenly became traps. Heavy doors that shielded them from rifle fire transformed into barriers that trapped heat. Darkness, their greatest advantage, turned into suffocating vulnerability when illuminated by a burst of flame rolling through narrow passages. Prisoners also spoke of the sound, the deep, mechanical roar that preceded the stream of fire. That noise alone caused entire units to abandon positions, often without orders, because instinct overpowered discipline. It wasn't cowardice. It was biology. Fire touches something ancient, something deeper than training or ideology. A gunshot might start, a grenade might shock. But flame, especially in confined environments, ignites a fear that bypasses thought entirely. Defenders who had held their ground through artillery barrages, supply shortages, and isolation admitted that the moment they heard that roar, the fight inside them cracked. Even the terrain responded differently when fire entered the equation. In thick jungle regions, the enemy used foliage as armor, disappearing behind layers of vines and shadows. But flame exposed the movement of air, revealing hidden shapes, footprints, and disturbed vegetation. In caves, the flicker of fire exposed depth, revealing silhouettes before flames even reached them. In bunkers, the glow illuminated corridors previously drowned in darkness. Fire didn't need to reach the enemy to change their behavior. Its presence alone reshaped the environment in ways nothing else could. Commanders soon realized that the flamethrower wasn't only a weapon of offense. It was a weapon of disruption. It fractured defensive planning, forced enemy units to reposition, and made previously reliable strategies collapse under the pressure of panic. In several operations, defenders fired wildly into the air the moment they saw a flame burst outside, revealing their positions and allowing infantry teams to advance with precision. Fire pulled reactions out of soldiers, the same way interrogators use pressure to extract information. It was involuntary, raw, and immediate. This growing understanding began shaping new tactical doctrine. The Army started pairing flamethrower teams with reconnaissance units, using brief flame bursts to provoke enemy movement. They learned that defenders betrayed themselves when they believed flame was approaching, even if It wasn't directed at them yet. The weapon had become more than heat and pressure. It had become a psychological lever commanders could pull to manipulate the flow of battle. And yet, even as both sides were rapidly adapting to this new reality, no one could predict the next revelation, how the flamethrower would go on to inspire entirely new methods of assault, infiltration, and territorial control, changing not just how soldiers fought, but how wars were planned at the highest levels. The psychological shockwaves of the flamethrower rippled across the battlefield. Commanders began noticing something else. The weapon wasn't just influencing individual engagements, it was shaping entire strategies. The rediscovery of flame power triggered a quiet transformation in military thinking, one that would ripple far beyond the initial battles where the redesigned weapon proved itself. Commanders who once relied on predictable artillery barrages and linear infantry assaults now began forming plans around a simple, unexpected truth. Fire could unlock routes, angles, and opportunities that no conventional weapon could reach. One of the first major doctrinal shifts emerged in the use of combined arms assault teams. Previously, flamethrower operators were viewed as specialists deployed in desperate situations. But after witnessing the cascading effects flame created, collapsed defenses, enemy repositioning, rapid morale breakdowns, the Army started integrating them into frontline squads from the start of an operation. This changed the rhythm of assaults entirely. Instead of advancing cautiously and responding to enemy fortifications as they appeared, commanders planned attacks that anticipated psychological disruption before the first burst of flame was even fired. Infantry squads moved faster, engineers coordinated more aggressively, and machine gun teams set up in places the enemy didn't expect. All because fire reshaped how defenders behaved inside their supposedly safe positions. The jungle warfare doctrine shifted as well. Dense vegetation that had once favored ambushes now provided a canvas for strategic flame bursts that cleared concealment, exposed hidden tunnels, and forced defenders into hastily chosen fallback points. In several operations, commanders used flame not to destroy the landscape, but to reveal it. A short burst would cut through layers of foliage, revealing trails, supply caches, and movement patterns that had been invisible before. This intelligence allowed infantry units to anticipate where defenders would relocate once their positions were compromised. Fire became a reconnaissance tool as much as a weapon. Urban operations evolved in unexpected ways to war-torn buildings, basements, and improvised strongholds often became traps for attacking forces. But flame proved uniquely effective at clearing enclosed spaces without requiring soldiers to enter immediately. Its expanding arcs illuminated corners, flushed out defenders, and forced movement through predictable routes. This allowed commanders to direct squads through safer entry points, reducing casualties in operations where every room and corridor could hide a threat. Instead of losing momentum with slow, methodical clearing, assaults gained speed and rhythm, using flame to break the inertia defenders relied on. But perhaps the most surprising innovation came in night operations. Darkness had traditionally given the enemy an advantage, especially when navigating tunnel networks or jungle terrain. Yet flame produced more than heat. It produced light, shadows, and an immediate sense of exposure. Commanders realized they could use this effect not just to attack, but to control fear itself. A brief flame burst outside a bunker at night disrupted sleep cycles, triggered confusion, and forced defenders to reorganize. In several engagements, flame teams were deployed strategically at nightfall to keep defenders off balance, disrupting their readiness long before an actual assault began. Fire blurred the line between offense and psychological warfare, creating pressure without sustained engagement. These evolving tactics inspired innovations in movement as well. flame teams began partnering with breaching units, creating synchronized advances where fire softened the environment seconds before infantry crossed thresholds. Walking into a bunker that had just been lit was entirely different from walking into one that had remained untouched. The air was warmer, the lighting was unpredictable, the smell and sound lingered, and defenders rarely held their positions. This synergy became so effective that some commanders referred to flame teams as momentum engineers, capable of shaping the emotional landscape of battle in ways explosives never could. Even defensive doctrine changed. When the army anticipated enemy counterattacks, flamethrower teams were positioned not to attack, but to manipulate enemy approaches. Fire could block narrow passes, deny access to cave entrances, or force regrouping in exposed terrain. It was the rare weapon that created temporary geography, a shifting barrier made of heat and instinctive fear. With every operation, Flame's role grew clearer. It wasn't just a weapon that fit into existing strategies. It was a weapon that created new strategies, new possibilities, and new rules. And yet, for all the tactical brilliance it enabled, the flamethrower carried a growing weight, one that would ignite fierce debates among commanders, politicians, and even soldiers themselves. Because while flame could win battles, it also forced the army to confront the moral edges of warfare more directly than ever before. As the flamethrower solidified its tactical importance, a new and unavoidable conflict erupted far from the battlefield, one fought in military councils, political chambers, and public debates. The very effectiveness that made the weapon indispensable also made it controversial. Soldiers who relied on it saw it as a lifeline, a tool that saved countless lives by neutralizing fortified positions that would have otherwise required deadly close-quarters assaults. But others, especially those who viewed war through the lens of morality rather than survival, saw something darker. Fire did not simply kill. It transformed the environment into a hostile force, blurring the line between necessity and brutality. The controversy grew. Louder once photographs and written accounts from the front lines began circulating back home. Reports emphasized not only the tactical successes, but also the harrowing reality of what flame did inside bunkers and tunnels. Critics argued that the weapon inflicted suffering beyond what was necessary, turning enclosed defensive structures into ovens from which there was no escape. They questioned whether psychological domination crossed an ethical boundary, even in the context of warfare. For many, the flamethrower symbolized the method of fighting that stripped away the detachment often associated with ranged combat. Fire was intimate, immediate, and unforgiving. Within the army, debates unfolded between commanders who prioritized effectiveness and those who feared the long-term implications of relying on a weapon that intensified the emotional trauma of war. The defenders of the flamethrower posed a simple, practical question. If the enemy chooses to hide in structures designed to maximize their protection and minimize their vulnerability, what alternative exists that avoids catastrophic casualties for assault teams? Every other method, explosives, risky entry, assaults, drawn-out sieges, carried a high probability of loss. Fire, they argued, forced a quick end to standoffs that might otherwise claim dozens of lives. Opponents countered with an equally powerful argument. War required discipline and ethical boundaries, even when the enemy disregarded them. They believed that normalizing the use of flame in confined spaces hardened soldiers emotionally in ways that might have consequences long after the war ended. Psychologists noted that operators of flamethrowers faced unique trauma. Unlike riflemen or machine gunners, they confronted the full sensory impact of fire, the sound, the heat, the immediate and visceral reactions of those on the receiving end, all of it imprinted deeply on the men who wielded the weapon. Some operators reported long-term psychological effects that went unaddressed for years. At the same time, geopolitical realities reshaped the conversation. Foreign governments monitored the U.S. military's use of flame closely, some condemning it publicly while quietly developing their own equivalents behind closed doors. If one nation mastered flame warfare, could others afford not to? Commanders warned that removing the flamethrower on moral grounds could place the army at a strategic disadvantage, especially if their adversaries saw no ethical issue with using it. War, after all, was not a contest of ideals. It was a contest of survival, and refusing to use a weapon that could break fortified positions might mean sacrificing lives unnecessarily. The most complex arguments came from soldiers themselves. Many infantrymen expressed gratitude for the presence of flame teams, believing that the weapon had saved their lives multiple times. They did not view it as cruelty, but as a practical response to an enemy who built defenses specifically to repel conventional attacks. To them, removing the flamethrower felt like asking them to charge headfirst into structures designed to kill them. Yet others spoke quietly of moments that haunted them, of being close enough to feel the heat roaring past their helmets, of hearing the echo of fire filling spaces where the enemy had no way to escape. These conflicting perspectives created a tension the army could not ignore. The weapon had become both a tactical necessity and a symbol of the darkest edges of warfare. But the controversy did something unexpected. It forced the military leaders to analyze the flamethrower, not just as a weapon of destruction, but as a tool with strategic, psychological, and ethical consequences. And this introspection would lead directly into the final chapter of its evolution, its legacy, its influence on modern incendiary systems, and the future shaped by a weapon the army once discarded. By the time the debate settled and the smoke of controversy drifted into the background, one truth had become unmistakably clear. The flamethrower had carved a permanent place in the evolution of warfare, but its legacy would not remain frozen in the era of bunkers and tunnel networks. Instead, it expanded outward, influencing new weapons, new philosophies about how armies confront environments designed to shield the enemy. The weapon the army once shelved as outdated and dangerous had become the blueprint for an entirely new category of battlefield control, one rooted in manipulating space, perception, and human instinct. The first step in this legacy came through technological transformation. As warfare modernized, bulky tanks and handheld nozzles gave way to lighter incendiary systems, mechanized carriers, and specialized projectors mounted on armored vehicles. These innovations weren't just upgrades. They represented an acknowledgement of what the flamethrower had proven fire could reach, where bullets and explosions failed, even as international laws and political pressures limited certain forms of incendiary weapons. Militaries quietly studied the core principles behind flame projection, area denial, environmental manipulation, psychological shock. Those principles reappeared in new equipment designed to overwhelm fortified positions without requiring soldiers to stand directly at the line of fire. Engineers developing modern incendiary technology often cited reports from earlier wars. They examined how fire traveled through enclosed structures, how it exploited airflow, how it exposed hidden spaces, and how it collapsed defensive morale. These insights shaped weapons that used controlled bursts of incendiary material or effects to achieve similar results with less risk to operators. In this way, the flamethrower's legacy lived on, even in systems that no longer resembled the original device. Fire had become data, something to be measured, replicated, and translated into new forms. Doctrinal shifts followed close behind. Commanders trained in the modern era began studying flamethrower operations not for the mechanics, but for the decision-making patterns they revealed. The idea that a single weapon could redefine defensive behavior caused militaries to rethink how they approached fortified terrain. Strategies began incorporating concepts inspired by flame warfare: overwhelming sensory disruption, rapid collapse of protective confidence, and forced displacement of defenders into predictable escape routes. Even non-incendiary units adopted versions of these tactics, using flash systems, pressure waves, and controlled detonations to mimic the psychological impact fire had once delivered so naturally. Perhaps the most unexpected part of the flamethrower's legacy, however, emerged in simulations and wargaming environments. Analysts discovered that defenders in virtual bunker tests reacted in strikingly similar ways to real soldiers exposed to flame. Even artificial environments highlighted fire's ability to break the illusion of safety. These findings influenced not only military planning but also the development of training programs, teaching soldiers how to adapt when facing enemies who rely on fortified structures as their primary advantage. And yet, for all its influence, the flamethrower also symbolized a turning point in the ethics of modern combat. As global norms shifted, many nations re-evaluated where the line between tactical necessity and unacceptable brutality should be drawn. The weapon that once changed the course of battles became a reminder of war's darkest tools that were sometimes indispensable and sometimes unbearable. Military historians now speak of the flamethrower as a paradox, a weapon that saved lives through effectiveness while simultaneously forcing humanity to confront the psychological cost of breaking entrenched defenses. In the end, what endured was not the machine itself, but the revelation it forced upon commanders. The battlefield is not just physical terrain, but emotional terrain. A soldier's sense of safety can be as strategically important as a hill or trench line. Fire leveraged that truth with unmatched intensity. Its legacy shaped doctrines that understood fear not as a byproduct of war, but as a variable that could be predicted, manipulated, and used to alter outcomes. As modern militaries advanced beyond the original flamethrower, they carried with them the lessons it etched into history: that no weapon is ever truly obsolete, that technology discarded in one era may become indispensable in another, and that the power to control space, physical and psychological, can define the fate of entire armies. The Army's rediscovery of the flamethrower was not just about refining a tool. It was about unlocking a truth that would echo through every evolution of warfare that followed. If you reached the end of this story, you are exactly the kind of viewer who transforms this channel into a place where real military history comes alive. So before you move on, take a moment to support the work that keeps these hidden chapters of warfare from fading into silence. Hit the like button, subscribe if you have not already, and let me know you are here by commenting the phrase, "I stayed until the last spark." Your voice in the comments helps push this content to more people who appreciate the truth behind the weapons, tactics, and decisions that shaped entire wars. And if you want to keep exploring the turning points that changed military history, your next video is already waiting for you on the screen.